The bride is not coming. Every person in the Moretti foyer went still. Vincent Callo, who had driven 4 hours with that sentence already formed in his mouth, said it to the wall of suited men, and one very large, very quiet man standing at the back of them. And then he said it again as if repetition would make it land differently. It did not. Raphael Moretti, who at 6'5" and 280 pounds of deliberate stillness, had not been told something he did not already know in longer than anyone present could remember, looked at Vincent Callo over the heads of 3 of his own people, and said nothing for 8 full seconds. "My daughter has obligations," Vincent said. "The other one is here." The other one. Rafe's gaze moved to the door. Everyone expected the evening to end before it had begun. Instead, Rafe said, "Bring her in." Nobody in the room understood why. At the door, a pair of heels clicked unevenly on marble, and then something fell. The something was a vase. It had been standing on the entry table for 11 years, and it had survived a great many things, and it did not survive June Callo, who caught her heel on the edge of the runner rug and reached for the table and missed the table and caught the vase instead, and then also missed that. And the vase went down in a clean arc and shattered on the floor with a sound that carried through the entire foyer and into the adjoining hallway and possibly into the next room. There was a silence. June stood in the wreckage of it, with her hands still out in the position of having tried to catch something and her shoes on wrong, meaning the heel that had caught the rug had done so because she had put on Serena's shoes in the car, because her own shoes had been in the bag she had left at the hotel, and Serena's shoes were a half size too small, and she had known this would happen, and it had happened, and she was standing in a stranger's foyer on what was apparently her wedding night, with a borrowed dress and borrowed shoes, and approximately 12 people staring at her, and she did what she had always done when the universe presented her with a situation like this one, which was to assess it clearly and speak. "I'll pay for that," she said to the room. Nobody moved. "The vase," she said. "I'll pay for it, or have it replaced. I assume it was expensive." She looked at the man at the back. He was very large. She had known he would be large because her father had mentioned it several times in the way people mention things they think might be deal-breakers. And she had decided, before she got in the car, that she was not going to treat it as a deal-breaker because she did not have the luxury of deal-breakers tonight. "I'm June. I'm sorry about your vase." Rafe Moretti looked at her for a moment. He had dark eyes and a face that had clearly decided at some point that expressions were optional and had mostly stopped bothering with them. And he was wearing a suit that had been constructed specifically to fit him rather than approximating the fit of a suit made for a smaller man. And he was looking at her with an attention that was neither welcome nor unwelcome, but was absolute. "It was a gift," he said. "I didn't like it." Someone in the room made a sound that was possibly the beginning of a laugh, and then thought better of it. June looked at the pieces on the floor, and then at him. "Then I've done you a favor." "You have." He moved then, for the first time, stepping forward through the space that opened automatically when he moved, which was something she would come to understand was simply how rooms worked around him. He stopped at a distance that was closer than she had expected, and farther than she had feared, and he held out his hand. "Raphael Moretti." She shook it. His hand was very large. She had medium-sized hands, and the proportion was notable, but not distressing, and she filed this under things that were simply true about the situation. "June Callo. I'm here instead of Serena. I assume you've been told." "I have. I'm also assuming you have questions." "I have those too." He looked at her feet. "You're standing on a piece of that." She looked down. There was a shard of the vase, approximately 3 inches from her right heel. She moved to step away from it, and misjudged the distance slightly, and he reached out and steadied her by the elbow with one hand, which was the first time he had touched her beyond the handshake, and which lasted approximately 2 seconds, and then he let go. "Thank you," she said. "Careful." He turned to the man nearest him. "Get someone to clean this up." Then he looked at the assembled Callo family representatives, which were her father and her uncle, and 2 of her father's associates who had come for moral support or to witness the disaster, depending on how the evening went. "Give us the room." Her father started to say something, and then appeared to think better of it, which was a thing her father did more frequently in the presence of Raphael Moretti than in any other context she had observed him in. And the room emptied with the particular efficiency of people who had been given an instruction by someone whose instructions were taken seriously. She was alone with him in the foyer with the broken vase and her wrong shoes and the borrowed dress, which was Serena's dress and therefore cut for Serena's proportions and not her own, and was doing its best, but was visibly compromised across the shoulders. And she stood in all of this and looked at him and waited, because she had learned a long time ago that waiting was free and talking was expensive. He looked at her for a moment. "You don't look like her." "No. We have the same father and different mothers. Serena takes after his side. And you take after yours." "Yes." He appeared to consider this as a fact rather than a problem, which she noted. "What do you know about tonight?" "That there was a contract. That my family owes yours a significant amount that the contract resolves. That Serena was supposed to be here and isn't." She paused. "And that you've agreed to proceed, which I am still processing." "Why?" She looked at him carefully. "Because most people in your position would have sent everyone home. You didn't. That suggests either that the contract matters more to you than who fulfills it, which I find unlikely given what the contract is, or that something about this situation specifically is acceptable to you, which I find curious." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression shifted in a way she could not precisely name. "You're precise," he said. "I'm practical. It's useful." He turned and walked toward the hallway. "Come, I'll show you the room." She followed him and managed the transition from the foyer tile to the hallway carpet without incident, which she counted as a success. The house was very large in the way of places that had been built to contain things worth protecting. She looked at the framed photographs on the walls as she passed them. The art that was selected rather than accumulated. The light fixtures that were expensive without being ostentatious. And she thought about what it would be like to move through this space every day, and whether she would get better at it or worse. This one. He stopped at a door on the 2nd floor. He opened it. The room inside was large and well-appointed, and had a window that looked over a garden that was dark but visible by the exterior lights. "There are things you'll need. If there are other things, tell whoever is at the house, and they will be arranged." She looked at the room. She looked at him. "What happens tomorrow?" "There's paperwork." "And after the paperwork?" He looked at her for a long moment. "That depends." "On what?" "On a number of things." He put his hand on the doorframe in the way of someone who is about to leave. "You didn't have to come tonight." She met his gaze. "I was asked." There's a distance between asked and came. She thought about the car ride, the borrowed dress, her father's face in the rearview mirror. "Not always," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked away, which was the first time he had looked away from her since she broke the vase. "Good night, June." "Good night," she said. He walked down the hallway. She stood in the doorway of the room that was apparently hers and watched him go and thought about the way he had said her name, which was with the ease of a word that did not require practice. She had not told him her name before she said it herself in the foyer. She had introduced herself as June, given him nothing to abbreviate, and he had said it cleanly, without hesitation, the way you said a name you had said before. She had not told him her name. She went into the room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, still in Serena's shoes, and thought about this for a long time. Her name was not in the contract. She knew this because she had seen a copy of the contract, briefly, in the car. And the name in the contract was Serena Elaine Callo. Her own name appeared nowhere in it. She was not supposed to be here tonight, and there was no document that anticipated she would be. And Raphael Moretti had said her name before she said it, and had said it like a word he knew. She sat with this for a long time. Then she took off Serena's shoes and set them neatly by the door, and lay down on top of the covers, still in the borrowed dress, and looked at the ceiling. I thought something is happening that I don't have all the information for, and I am going to need to find the information. And tomorrow is probably soon enough to start. She was asleep in 12 minutes, which was the fastest she had fallen asleep in a situation of high uncertainty in recent memory. And she would think about that later too. The house was the size of a problem she had not anticipated. She had anticipated the size of him, because her father had mentioned it with the specific frequency of a man who considered it relevant information and expected her to consider it a warning. She had not anticipated the size of the house, which was not large in the way of houses that were large to impress, but large in the way of houses that were large because the person who lived in them, they required a certain amount of space to exist comfortably, and had arranged for that space without apology. There were rooms she did not yet know the purpose of. There were hallways that led to other hallways. There was a library that she found on the second morning by accident, when she was looking for the kitchen from a different direction than she had come from the first time, and opened the wrong door, and found floor to ceiling shelves and 2 chairs positioned the way chairs were positioned, when someone actually sat in them and thought. She stood in the doorway of the library for a moment, and then backed out quietly as if she had walked in on something private. The first morning had been paperwork. As promised, a lawyer came at 9 and there were documents, and she signed them and Rafe signed them, and at the end of it she was legally married in the state of New York to a man she had known for less than 12 hours, which was a fact she held at arm's length for most of the morning, because holding it close would have required a response she did not yet have available. He had been at the other end of the table for the paperwork. He had his own lawyer. He had answered questions in the compact way he answered everything, without elaboration. When they were done, he had looked at her across the table and said, "The house is yours to use as you want. If something doesn't work, say so." She had said, "All right." He had said, "I'm usually out by 7. She had said, "That's fine." And that had been the extent of their first morning as a married couple, which she thought was probably appropriate given the circumstances. On the second morning she found the kitchen without incident, which she counted as progress. She made coffee because she knew how to make coffee in any kitchen, regardless of the equipment, which was a skill she had developed from years of waking up earlier than anyone else in any house she had lived in, and wanting coffee before anyone was available to ask where things were. She was sitting at the kitchen island with the coffee when Rafe came through at 6:45. He looked at her. He looked at the coffee maker. He looked at her again. "You've figured out the coffee maker," he said. "It has a single serve option." She held up her mug. "There's more in the carafe if you want it." He went to the cabinet with the ease of knowing exactly where everything was, and got a mug, and poured coffee, and stood at the counter across from her and drank it. And she drank hers. And neither of them said anything for a while, which was not uncomfortable in the way that silences in new situations were usually uncomfortable, but simply quiet. 2 people in a kitchen early in the morning, before the day had made demands. "You were up early," he said. "I'm always up early." "Why?" She thought about it. "I'm not sure. It started as habit and now it's just how I'm made." She looked at the window over the sink, which showed the garden in the early light, which was a good garden. Designed rather than tended, with bones that would hold up through seasons. That's a good garden. He looked at the window. "I don't use it much." "You should. The light is good in the mornings." She stood to take her mug to the sink, and her elbow caught the edge of the sugar bowl that was sitting near the edge of the island, and the sugar bowl tipped, and she caught it with both hands before it went over. She set it back carefully. She looked at it for a moment to make sure it was stable. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was not amusement and not concern, but something between the two. Attentive and level. "Are you all right?" "Yes." She moved the sugar bowl to the center of the island where it was less in danger. "I do that." The catching and the knocking, in roughly equal proportions. "I've noticed. The vase was not my best moment. You caught the sugar bowl." "I did." She put her mug in the sink. "I'm a work in progress." He looked at her for a moment. "Most things are," he said. And then he took his coffee to wherever he went in the mornings, and she stood at the kitchen sink and thought about that for a while. She spent the second day learning the geography of the house in the methodical way she learned the geography of any new space, which was by moving through it slowly and noting what was where and what the light did at different times and where the noise came from and where it didn't. The house had a particular silence in the afternoon that was different from the morning silence and different from the evening silence, and she sat in 3 different rooms at different points to get the quality of each. She knocked over a small decorative object in the study and caught it. She walked into a door that was not fully open in the upstairs hallway and said something under her breath that she would not have said in company. She found the library and stood in the doorway and retreated. She found a sunroom off the back of the house that had not been mentioned and that was full of afternoon light and had a couch that was positioned with the specific intention of someone who understood that sunlight at a particular angle was worth arranging furniture around. And she sat there for an hour and read the book she had brought in her bag and thought about the fact that someone had positioned that couch that way, and that someone was almost certainly the man who did not use the garden. On the 3rd day, she found the painting. She had been in the study, which she had been given implicit permission to use because Rafe had said the house was hers to use and the study was part of the house. And she had been sitting at the desk, not using the desk for anything official, but simply sitting in a room with good light and thinking, and she had looked at the wall and seen it. It was not a large painting. It was perhaps 18 inches square, and it was hanging slightly to the left of center on the wall behind the desk, positioned as though it had been put there for the person sitting at the desk to look at, not for anyone coming into the room. It was a painting of a specific moment, a street corner at night, rain on the pavement, a food cart with yellow light, and a crowd of people who had no umbrellas, all crowded under the awning of the adjacent building in the way that crowds crowded under awnings when rain arrived without warning. It was painted with the kind of accuracy that came from someone who had been there, or from someone who had been told about it by someone who had been there with enough precision that the telling became visual. She knew that corner. She knew it not vaguely, not as a corner that resembled a corner she had been near, but specifically the angle of the awning, the placement of the cart, the particular way the crowd had organized itself, because the building's awning was narrower on the left side and people had instinctively moved right. She knew it because she had been there at a fundraiser for a city planning commission 2 years ago, and it had rained without warning at 10:15 at night, and she had been standing with a plate of food from the cart and nowhere to go, and she had said something to the person next to her about the rain, and that person had laughed. She sat at the desk and looked at the painting for a long time. Then she looked at the small inscription in the lower right corner of the painting, which was not the artist's name, but a date and a location. The corner, the month, the year. The year was 8 months before the contract. The month was the month of the fundraiser. She had been at a city planning fundraiser 8 months before the contract. She had been standing in the rain with a plate of food, and she had said something, and someone had laughed. And she had not seen who it was because the crowd was pressing in, and the rain was getting worse, and she had been focused on not dropping the plate. which she had not dropped, which she had counted as a victory at the time. She looked at the painting. She looked at the inscription. She thought about her name, said with the ease of a word that did not require practice. She got up from the desk and she went to find Rafe, who was in the kitchen when she came downstairs, standing at the counter reading something on his phone. He looked up when she came in. "The painting in the study," she said. He held her gaze. "The corner," she said. "In the rain. The food cart." Something in his expression did the thing it had done when she said she was practical, a small shift, present, suggested, that she was becoming able to see in the gap between his face and his face. "What about it?" he said. She looked at him carefully. She looked at the way he was holding his phone, and the way he was looking at her, and the way he was not quite still, but was performing stillness, which was different from actually being still, and was a thing she had learned to distinguish in her father and her uncle, and the various men who came and went in her family's orbit, who needed to appear controlled, because control was the thing they had. "I was there," she said, "at that corner, at that event." He set his phone down. "Yes." She held his gaze. "Did you know that?" He did not answer immediately, which was an answer. She stood in the kitchen of the house she had been married into 3 days ago, and she looked at her husband, and she thought about names, said, with the ease of words that had been practiced, and paintings of specific corners at specific times, and a father who had said the other one is here, in the foyer, in the way of someone delivering news that had already been anticipated. And she thought about how the information assembled and what shape it made when it assembled. "We need to talk," she said. "Yes," he said. "We do." She pulled out the stool at the island and sat down. He stayed where he was at the counter, which was across from her, which was the right distance for a conversation that needed to happen without either party running. "Tell me what I'm missing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the waiting quiet, not the finding words quiet, but the particular quiet of a man deciding how much of a decision he had already made. Then he said, "Not tonight." She looked at him. "Why not tonight?" "Because I want to tell you properly, and I want to do it when I'm certain of what I'm saying." He held her gaze. "Give me 2 days." She thought about it. She thought about the painting, and the name, and the foyer, and the fact that she had been asked, and had come, and was sitting in this kitchen 3 days later, with more questions than she. He had arrived with, and a husband who was asking her to wait 2 days before he answered them. 2 days. She said. "And then you tell me everything." "Everything," he said. She got up and took a glass from the cabinet, which she now knew where to find, and filled it with water and drank some of it. She set it on the island. She looked at the painting she could not see from here, but that she was now aware of in the way that you became aware of things once they had shifted from background to foreground. "The sugar bowl is in the center of the island now," she said, "in case you were wondering where I moved it." He looked at the sugar bowl. He looked at her. Good placement. She went to the sunroom to read. She sat in the afternoon light on the couch that had been positioned with intention, and she read her book, and she did not think about the painting. Mostly. And outside the garden had the last of the afternoon light on it, and the bones of it were very good. 2 days. She thought. She could work with 2 days. The event was on a Friday. Rafe had told her the night before there was a dinner. It was expected that she would attend. She did not have to stay the full evening. He had said it in the way he said things that were practical, without preamble. And she had said what kind of dinner, and he had said the kind where people see who I've married. She had looked at him across the kitchen island and said, "Right." And he had said, "You don't have to." And she had said, "I said right, not no." She bought a dress in the 2 days between finding the painting and the dinner. She bought it herself, which she mentioned to no one because it was not the kind of thing that required mentioning. And she bought the kind of dress she bought when she needed to be in a room full of people who would look at her and make assessments, something dark. Fitted well, because she knew how to find clothes that fit, with enough structure to carry itself regardless of what the evening required of her. She had been dressing herself in rooms where people looked and made assessments for a long time, and she was very good at it. The dinner was at a restaurant that had been closed to the public for the evening. There were 40 people. She knew none of them by face, and some of them by name. The names that moved through a particular kind of conversation, in a particular kind of room, with a particular kind of weight. She had grown up adjacent to those names without being inside the rooms they belonged to, which meant she knew what they meant, and what the weight was, and how to carry herself around them, which was a thing Serena would not have known, and she briefly noted this and set it aside. Rafe introduced her to 3 people in the first 15 minutes. He was good at introductions in the particular way of someone who did not enjoy them, but understood their function and executed them efficiently. Name. Connection. A sentence about the other person that gave her something to work with. He stayed close without hovering, which was a calibration she noticed because most men in that situation either hovered or disappeared, and he did neither. She talked to a woman named Harriet who designed buildings and had strong opinions about load-bearing walls that June found genuinely interesting. She talked to a man named Cavallo, who had the particular energy of someone who was assessing her for something specific and not doing a very good job of disguising it. She ate the appetizer without incident. The incident happened during the second course. She was standing near the window with a glass of water. Having excused herself from a conversation that had reached its natural conclusion, when she heard it, 2 men, to her left and slightly behind her, speaking at a volume that was designed to be heard by the people they were speaking with, and not much further. She recognized the voice of the man named Cavallo. "Doesn't look like the usual," Cavallo said, "for him or for anyone around here." The other man said something she did not catch. "Both of them," Cavallo said. "I mean, physically. Both of them. You've seen Moretti, and now this. Pause. I'm just saying. It's an unusual pairing." She stood at the window and looked at the garden outside, which was lit for the evening, and which had the kind of deliberate planting that suggested it was tended by someone who knew what they were doing. She held her water glass. She thought about what she was going to do about the next 30 seconds, and she decided. She turned around. She looked directly at Cavallo, who was standing 6 feet away and who had the specific expression of a man who had just realized he had been heard by the person being discussed and was recalibrating. The man beside him had gone very still. "I'm sorry," she said, pleasantly. "Were you discussing the garden? I was just looking at it. The spacing on the yew hedges is interesting, isn't it, for a property this size?" Cavallo blinked. "The hedges. The yew. They're cut for height rather than width, which makes sense given the sightlines. But it means whoever maintains them has to get up there more often than you'd think." She tilted her head slightly. "Do you garden?" He looked at his companion. His companion appeared to be thinking about somewhere else he needed to be. "No," Cavallo said. "Neither do I." She smiled. The kind of smile that was warm and contained nothing. "But I find I'm learning a great deal about the subject lately. Very interesting what you notice when you start paying attention." She turned back to the window. She heard Cavallo say something quietly to his companion, and then both of them moved away. And she stood at the window and looked at the yew hedges for a moment longer, and then finished her water. When she turned back to the room, Rafe was standing 4 feet away. She had not heard him come up. He was the kind of large that ought to be audible when it moved, but was not, which she had noted before and noted again. He was looking at her with the expression that had the small, contained shift in it, which she was now able to identify as the expression he had when he was processing something he had not expected. "The hedges," he said. "I was looking at them. The spacing. It's interesting." He was quiet for a moment. "That was well done." She looked at him. "I didn't do anything." You took the room away from him, he said, without making him the subject of it. He looked at where Cavallo had been standing. He would have made it worse if you'd given him something to respond to. She thought about this. I know. That's why I didn't. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing the shift again, but more slowly this time, staying longer. Where did you learn to do that? From being the one people talked about at parties for a long time. She set her empty glass on the tray of a passing server. You learned the geometry of it. He was quiet. They were standing close enough that she was aware of the size of him in the particular way she was always aware of it, which was not uncomfortable, but was present, like standing near something that changed the weather slightly. She had decided in the first day that she was not going to perform being comfortable because performing was exhausting and she had better things to spend the energy on. So what she had arrived at was simply actual comfort, which had surprised her, but which she had decided to accept. You've been dealing with it longer than I have, she said. The being noticed. He looked at her. It's different for you, she said, but it's also not different. People look and they make a thing out of it, and then they use it. She paused. You manage it differently than I do. How do I manage it? She thought about it. You make it a wall. You let the size be the thing people see, so they don't see other things. She said it without judgment, as information. It works well, as a strategy. He was quiet for a moment. And you, I make it a joke, she said, before anyone else can. It's also a wall, just a different shape. The dinner continued around them. Someone was making a toast somewhere behind her, and she was not the subject of it, and neither was he, and the evening had reached the phase where it was going to start winding down. And she thought, 2 days is tomorrow. I'll tell you tomorrow, he said. She looked at him. He had been looking at the room, and now he was looking at her. The painting, he said. The full story. I promised you 2 days. Tomorrow. She nodded. She looked at the window and the hedges outside, and thought about geometry and walls, and what you could see when you got the angle right. The you really is interesting, she said. He looked at the window. He looked at the hedges. And then he did something she had not yet seen him do, which was that something in his face stopped performing stillness and was simply still, the real kind. And the corners of his mouth moved in a way that was small and was real and was, she thought, a smile, the kind that happened because something was actually funny rather than because the situation required one. You're going to be trouble, he said. She considered this. Probably, she said, but I'm good at geometry. They drove home in the car that had the kind of quiet she was beginning to understand was his natural register. And she looked at the city going past and thought about the evening and about Cavallo and about what Rafe had said. You took the room away from him. And about the fact that he had been 4 feet away and she had not heard him come up, and that meant he had been there for a while, watching. The Cavallo situation, she said. Is that going to be a recurring problem? Probably not after tonight. He was looking out the window on his side. He'll have reassessed by morning. Because of the hedges. Because of the hedges. Pause. And because of how you looked at him. He's a man who needs the other person to be bothered. You weren't. I was a little bothered. You didn't show it. She thought about this. I've had practice. He turned and looked at her, and she could see his face in the passing light of the street. The particular quality of his attention, which was the one thing about him that was not calibrated for distance, that landed fully when it landed. I know, he said. She looked back at the city. She thought about walls and shapes and the difference between performing a thing and being it. And she thought about tomorrow. And she thought about the fundraiser 8 months ago, and the rain and a plate of food and someone laughing. And she did not yet know who was on the other side of that laugh, but she had a theory, and the theory was becoming a certainty, and she was going to hear it in his own words tomorrow, and she decided that was enough for tonight. The house was quiet when they got back. She went up and changed and came back down for water, and he was in the kitchen, not doing anything specific, just standing with his coffee and the kitchen around him. And she filled her glass, and he said, "You handled yourself well tonight." And she said, "So did you." And he looked at her with the expression, and she went back upstairs. And the house settled into its nighttime quiet. And she lay in her room and thought that the shape of what she was living in was becoming more clear, and that it was a more interesting shape than she had been given to expect. He told her in the study. She had thought about where the conversation would happen and had concluded it would be the kitchen, because the kitchen was where they had their conversations. But he knocked on the study door at 10 in the morning, and when she opened it, he was standing in the hallway and he said, "Come in here." He had chosen the room with the painting, which she thought was deliberate, and which she thought was the right choice. She sat in the chair across from the desk. He sat at the desk, but did not use the desk as a desk, meaning he did not put anything on it and did not use it for distance. He sat in the chair behind it and put his hands on his knees and looked at her the way he looked at things he was going to say carefully. The painting was behind him. She could see it over his right shoulder. "The fundraiser," he said, 8 months ago. "Yes, I was there." He held her gaze. "I was there for a different reason. A contact I needed to speak with who was attending. And that was the most efficient way to do it, without a formal meeting." He paused. "It rained." "It rained," she said. "There was a food cart. The awning on the building wasn't wide enough, and everyone crowded under it. I was on the right side, toward the back, and you were in front of me and to the left." She looked at him. The rain. The crowd pressing right, because the awning was narrower on the left side. She had been toward the left, which meant she had been near the narrow edge, which meant the person who was on the right side toward the back would have been close enough to her, but slightly behind. "I was holding a plate," she said. "Mushroom pastry," he said, "from the cart. You'd been trying to get to the front of the line for about 10 minutes, and you'd been elbowed twice, and you hadn't said anything to anyone until you finally got there, and the person running the cart ran out of the mushroom ones just before you and made more, and you waited. And when you finally got them, you turned around, and the crowd was too thick to move, and it was raining, and you were stuck, and you said something." She looked at him. She was trying to remember the specific moment, and she had parts of it. The plate, the rain, the frustration of the crowd. But not the person next to her, because she had been focused on not dropping the plate. "What did I say?" "You said well. I've been in worse situations, but I'm struggling to think of one right now." She heard her own voice in the words, and knew they were hers. "And you laughed." "Yes." She sat with this for a moment. She thought about a crowd in the rain and a plate of food and a sentence said to no one in particular. The kind of sentence she said when she was thinking out loud, and someone behind her and to the right laughing. And she had not seen the face, because she had been looking at the plate, and then the rain had gotten worse, and people had shifted, and it had been 10 minutes before she could move at all. "You had me looked into after that," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." And 3 months later, the contract came up. "The contract came up before," he said. "Your father had been in discussions with my people for some time. The contract in its original form specified Serena." He looked at the desk for a moment, and then at her. "When I found out who you were, I didn't change the contract. I left the name as it was." She looked at him. "Because you didn't think it was appropriate to change it. Because I didn't know if you would want to be in it." He said it plainly. "The contract was a transaction your father had initiated. I wasn't going to put your name in a contract you hadn't agreed to be in." She was quiet for a moment. "But when Serena didn't come, when your father called me 3 hours before you arrived and told me Serena wasn't coming and asked if I would accept you as a substitute, I said yes." He held her gaze. I said yes, because I wanted to. She sat in the chair across from the desk and looked at her husband and thought about everything she had just heard, assembled against everything she had been operating on for the past week, which was the assumption that she was a substitute accepted because the contract required a Callo daughter, and she was the available Callo daughter. And she thought about what it meant that the assumption was wrong. And she thought about whether being wrong about it made her feel better or worse. She felt something that was not quite either. You managed the entire thing, she said, from 8 months ago. You knew who I was. You knew about the contract. You knew about the substitution before it happened. And you never said anything to me about any of it. Not when I got here. Not in the foyer. Not in 3 days of coffee in the morning. He looked at her steadily. Yes. That's a significant amount of information to withhold. Yes, he said. It is. Why? He was quiet for a moment. She let the quiet be what it was, and did not fill it. She had learned from watching him that some silences were doing work and should not be interrupted. And this was one of those. Because I didn't know how to tell you that the reason I agreed to the substitution was that I had laughed at something you said in the rain 8 months ago, and I hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. He said it without elaboration. The way he said things that were simply true and cost something to say, because I was aware that this was not a reasonable thing to have done, and I didn't know how to put it in a context that made it reasonable, and I kept thinking I would find a way, and I didn't. She looked at him. She thought about reasonable, and what reasonable meant, and whether it was the right measure. She thought about a man who moved through rooms that opened around him, and who built walls out of size and silence, and who had laughed at something she said in the rain and had not been able to stop thinking about it. She thought about herself in the car on the way here, in the borrowed dress, having been asked and having come, and she thought about whether she had been asked or whether she had simply been the person available. And she thought about the fact that he had said yes to the substitution before she had agreed to be the substitution, which meant he had said yes first, and she had said yes after. And they had said yes for reasons that were not the same reasons, but that had landed them in the same place. She was angry. She was angry in the clear, specific way. She was angry when she understood exactly what had happened and exactly who had done it, and exactly why it was not acceptable, which was the best kind of angry to be, because it did not require drama, just clarity. I need to say some things, she said. Yes, he said. You do. You made a decision on my behalf, she said. A significant one, you decided, based on a sentence I said in the rain that I don't even clearly remember, that you wanted me in this house. And then you arranged a situation where I would end up in this house without telling me that's what you wanted or why. She looked at him. And then when I got here, you said the house is yours to use as you want, as if you were being generous, when actually you had already decided I would be here, and you had said yes before I said yes, and you arranged the circumstances of my saying yes without telling me what you knew. He held her gaze. He did not flinch, and he did not explain, and he did not try to make it smaller than it was. That's accurate, he said. It's a problem. Yes. It's a significant problem. I know. She stood up. She walked to the window because she needed to not be sitting across from him while she was thinking, and because the window gave her something to look at that was not his face, which was the face of someone who was receiving what she was saying without managing it, which was making it harder to stay angry in the clean way she needed to stay angry. The sentence, she said, in the rain. What was it about it? He was quiet for a moment. It was the most honest thing I'd heard anyone say out loud in a room full of people in a long time. He paused. Most people in that situation would have said nothing, or made a show of being fine, or apologized to the crowd for existing. You said I've been in worse situations, but I'm struggling to think of one right now. It was exactly what was true. No performance. No management. Another pause. I had not heard something like that in a very long time. She stood at the window and looked at the garden and thought about what he had just said and what it meant that he had said it. "You're describing yourself," she said. "The performance. The management." He was quiet. "You do it all the time," she said. "The stillness. The not showing things. You perform not performing, and you're very good at it, and it keeps people at the distance you want them." She turned and looked at him. "And I said something in the rain that didn't do that, and you noticed, because you're always watching for it, and because you do it yourself and you know exactly what the absence of it looks like." He looked at her. The expression was doing the shift, but this time it stayed. It did not contain itself and go back. And she saw, in the gap of it, something she had not seen before, which was that it was not a small shift at all. It was a large thing that he had been holding behind the stillness for a long time. And she was the first person in a long time who had gotten the angle right. "Yes," he said, "that's right." She turned back to the window. She was still angry. She was angry about the management and about the information withheld and about being said yes to before she had said yes. And she was going to stay angry about those things because they deserved anger. And she was also going to hold alongside the anger the thing he had just said, which was the most honest thing I'd heard anyone say out loud in a long time. And she was going to let those two things exist at the same time, because they were both true, and she was good at holding two true things at the same time. "I need some days," she said. "Take them." She turned around. "Not to leave. I'm not talking about leaving." She looked at him clearly. "I'm talking about processing what you've told me and deciding what I think about it and whether I think you've earned the right to have done it." She paused. "I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to tell you what I conclude." He looked at her. "All right. And while I'm thinking about it," she said, "you're going to be in this house, and I'm going to be in this house, and we're going to have coffee in the morning because the coffee is good, and that doesn't need to change." She paused. "But I'm angry, and you know why, and you're going to let me be angry about it without trying to fix it." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "I will." She looked at him one more time. She looked at the painting behind him, the street corner in the rain, the food cart, the crowd under the awning, the specific accuracy of it. She thought about a plate of mushroom pastry, and a sentence said to no one in particular, and a laugh she had not seen the face of. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "Yes," he said, "I should have." She walked to the door. She put her hand on the doorframe. She was angry, and she was going to be angry for a few days, and she was also, underneath the anger, aware of something else that she did not have a name for yet, and was not going to name until she was less angry and could look at it more clearly. "The sentence," she said, without turning around, "in the rain." "Yes, I meant it," she said. "It was a very bad situation. The rain and the plate and the crowd." She paused. "But I've been in worse." She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a breath. Something in between. She went out into the hallway and closed the door behind her and walked to the sunroom and sat in the afternoon light on the couch that had been positioned with intention. And she was angry. And she was thinking. And the garden outside had good bones. And she thought, "I need a few days. And I have them. And that will be enough." She was angry for 2.5 days. This was not her longest angry, which was 4 days in her 24th year, over a situation involving her father and a promise he had made and not kept, and which she had concluded with the understanding that she could not change what her father would or would not do. But she could change what she expected of him, which had been useful and which she had applied to several situations since. 2.5 days was, she thought, proportionate to the situation, significant enough to be taken seriously, short enough to be productive. She spent the first day in the sunroom and the library and 2 long walks around the property that she had not been on before, which was large enough that she had genuinely not been to all of it. And she thought about 8 months and a sentence in the rain and a man who had laughed and had not stopped thinking about it and had not told her. She thought about walls and what they were for and whether she was angry at the wall or at the fact that she had not been given the information to decide for herself whether to stand near it. She concluded it was the second thing. She was not angry at who he was. She was angry at not having been given the choice to know who he was before the situation was already arranged, which was a different anger and a more specific one. On the second morning, she came down to the kitchen, and he was there, and they had coffee, and neither of them addressed it, which was right. She knocked the sugar bowl off the island completely on the second morning, which she had never done before, only tipped it. And it went off the edge, and he caught it one-handed before it hit the floor and set it back on the island without comment. And she said, "Thank you." And he said yes. And they drank their coffee. On the second afternoon, she sat in the library for the first time, in one of the 2 chairs that were positioned the way chairs were positioned when someone actually used them. And she read. The library had the particular quality of a room that had been curated over time by someone who read for their own reasons and not for the impression of having read, which was visible in the organization, which was neither alphabetical nor by subject, but by some internal logic that she spent 45 minutes tracing before she understood it. And when she understood it, she sat with the understanding for a while, because it told her something about the way he organized his mind that she had not known before and that she found she wanted to know. He came in at 5 and saw her in the chair and stopped. She looked at him over the top of her book. He looked at the chair, which was his chair, which she had not known was his chair until this moment, which she deduced from the way he looked at it, the way you looked at something that was in the place where it was supposed to be and which you had not expected to find there. Your chair, she said. You can use it. I will, she said, and went back to her book. And he went to the other chair and sat in it and took his phone out and read something on it. And they were in the library at 5 o'clock, and neither of them said anything for an hour, and it was the most comfortable she had been in the house since she arrived. On the third morning, she woke at 5:45, which was earlier than usual, and lay in bed for a while, and thought about the anger, which was still present but had changed in the way that anger changed when you had spent enough time with it to understand its actual shape. It was real, and it was justified, and it was also, she now understood, sitting on top of something else that had been there since the foyer, and the broken vase, and a name said with the ease of a word that did not require practice. She got up. She put on the clothes she wore in the mornings, and she went to the kitchen, and it was 6 o'clock, and the kitchen was empty, and she made coffee, and then she stood at the counter, and thought, 3 days is not quite up, and I said I would tell him what I concluded, and I have concluded, and it is 6 o'clock in the morning, and I am standing in his kitchen with this conclusion, and there is nothing preventing me from acting on it, except the arbitrary nature of the deadline I set. She went to the hall outside his room and knocked. A pause. Then yes. It's June. She paused. I've concluded. A longer pause. Then the door opened and he was there, large in the doorway. In the way he was large in all doorways, dressed, but not in the suit. In the dark trousers and grey shirt, that was what he wore before the day made the suit necessary, and he looked at her with the full attention that landed when it landed. Come in, he said, or we can go to the kitchen. Kitchen, she said. They went to the kitchen. He poured himself coffee from what she had made and sat across the island from her, and she stood on her side with her hands around her mug, and she said, You withheld information that I had a right to when making a significant decision about my own life. She looked at him. That was wrong, and it is not something I am willing to have happen again. He held her gaze. Understood. I mean that specifically, she said. Not as a general statement of values. I mean that if you have information that affects my situation, I expect to have it. Not all of your information. Not things that are not mine to know. But things that affect me. She paused. That is a condition of whatever this is. That is a reasonable condition, he said, and I agree to it. She looked at him for a moment. Good. She set her mug down. The other thing. He waited. The sentence in the rain. She said, I believe you, that it was what it was. I believe that you heard it, and you remembered it, and that it mattered to you in the way you said. She looked at him steadily. I also believe that it was a disproportionate thing to build 8 months of arrangement on, and that a more functional version of you would have found a way to say, I was at that fundraiser and I heard something you said and I'd like to meet you properly. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. That would have been better. It would have been significantly better. She picked up her mug. So that's a thing we're working on. The finding a way to say things directly, instead of arranging the circumstances until the thing happens without saying. He looked at her. We, she said. I do it too. Differently. But I do it. She thought about the vase and the sugar bowl and the way she made things fall before anyone else could use them against her. We are both people who have spent a long time managing from a distance, and we are now in a house together, and that is going to require some adjustment. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the coffee in his mug and then at her. You're not leaving, he said. Not a question exactly, but the shape of something he was checking the solidity of. I'm not leaving, she said. I was never leaving. I told you that on the second day. She paused. I'm also not staying because I don't have anywhere else to go. I want to be clear about that. He looked at her. Then why? She thought about this. She thought about the library and the chair and the way the room had been organized according to an internal logic that took 45 minutes to understand and that she had found she wanted to understand. She thought about most things are. She thought about the hedge spacing and the sunroom couch and the garden that he didn't use but that someone had designed with intention. She thought about a man who had laughed in the rain at a sentence, said to no one in particular and had not stopped thinking about it. Because I want to see how this goes, she said, properly, with the information on the table instead of managed from a distance. She looked at him, and because you're good at the quiet, I didn't know I needed someone who was good at the quiet until I was in a house with one. He was looking at her with the expression that no longer contained itself, the one she had seen in the study when the shift stayed. And she held it and did not look away, because looking away would have been the distance thing, and she was done with the distance thing, at least for this morning. All right, he said. All right, she said. She finished her coffee. She put the mug in the sink. She turned around, and he was still there at the island with his coffee, and she said, The library organization. Is it by emotional register or by the time of day you'd want to read the book? He looked at her. The shift happened, and this time it went all the way. The stillness dropped entirely, and he looked at her with something that was unmanaged and real and entirely his. Time of day, he said. She nodded slowly. I thought so. Morning is on the east shelf. Afternoon is the south. Late night is the back corner. Yes, I was in the afternoon section yesterday. I know. I saw which chair you were in. She looked at him for a moment and thought about being seen in the right section of a library by a person who organized it by time of day and who had laughed at a sentence in the rain and who stood very still in the kitchen at 6 a.m. with his coffee and the quiet around him. She went back upstairs to get her own book, and when she came back down, he was still in the kitchen, and the morning was beginning outside the window, and the garden had the early light on it in the way she had described to him on the second day, and she looked at it, and he looked at it, and neither of them said anything about it, because some things did not need saying. 3 days later, she was in the kitchen at 6:15 when she heard sounds she had not heard before from the general direction of the kitchen, which she was already in, which meant the sounds were coming from the kitchen, which she discovered upon investigation were coming from Rafe, who was standing at the counter with a cookbook and several bowls, and an expression of focused concentration that she associated with him when he was doing something he was not yet certain of. She stood in the doorway and looked at the bowls and the cookbook and him. "What are you making?" He looked up. He looked at the cookbook. "Cacio y pepe," he said. "You mentioned it." She looked at him. She had mentioned it once, in passing, 11 days ago, in the context of something else entirely. The kind of passing mention that people made without expecting anyone to retain it. "When did I mention it?" "The third evening. You said it was the only thing worth eating when the weather turned cold." He looked at the cookbook again. "I've been working on the technique." She looked at the bowls and the pasta and the specific expression on his face, which was not performing anything, which was simply a man trying to get the pasta right. And she thought about walls and shapes and the specific geometry of how two people who had spent a long time managing from a distance could find their way toward the same table. She set down her book. "The technique is in the wrist," she said. "When you add the cheese, you have to keep the water moving." He looked at her. "Show me." She came to the counter and stood beside him, and she showed him, and he watched with the full attention. And she did not knock anything over. And the pasta was good. And they ate it at the kitchen island in the early morning before the day made its demands. And outside the garden was in the light she had described to him on the second day. And the house was the right size. And they were in it. And that was enough. That was, she thought, a very good enough.